Tonight, a major step for this new commander-in-chief.
Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched.
The president addressed the nation from Mar-a-Lago, his Florida estate, leveling a harsh indictment against Syrian President Bashar Al Assad.
Using a deadly nerve agent, Assad choked out the lives of helpless men, women, and children.
2 U.S. destroyers in the eastern Mediterranean fired dozens of Tomahawk cruise missiles into a Syrian airfield, targeting runways, aircrafts, and fueling areas to make the field inoperable. It's the same airfield that the Syrian planes involved in Tuesday's chemical attack took off from. This video, just released from the Pentagon, the swift military response from the U.S. comes just 2 days after the images of that horrific chemical attack in northern Syria appalled the world. An attack allegedly carried out by the Syrian regime of Bashar Al Assad against its own citizens. As many as 86 people were killed, including 30 women and 20 children, killed by what Turkish officials who have examined the bodies are now saying was sarin gas. These graphic images posted online by activists and people who live in the area show victims struggling to breathe.
It is in this vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons.
President Trump's response tonight marks a 180-degree about-face by a man who repeatedly said over the years he didn't want to get involved in Syria at all. Just 2 days ago, he said this.
I'm not, and I don't want to be, the president of the world. I'm the president of the United States. And from now on, it's going to be America first.
Back in 2013, after Assad's last chemical weapons attack, Trump tweeted, again to our very foolish leader, do not attack Syria. If you do, many bad things will happen. And from that fight, the U.S. gets nothing. But after seeing Tuesday's images like this one of a father cradling his lifeless children, the president had a dramatic change of heart.
Do you think that Assad should leave power in Syria?
I think what happened in Syria is a disgrace to humanity. And he's there, and I guess he's running things, so something should happen.
With tonight's airstrike, Trump may now find himself deep in just the kind of overseas entanglement this avowedly America First president has promised to avoid.
Tonight I call on all civilized nations to join us in seeking to end the slaughter and bloodshed in Syria, and also to end terrorism of all kinds and all types.
Syria's civil war started 6 years ago as part of the Arab Spring, where citizens across the Arab world rose up against tyrannical leaders. Syria's President Assad, on the surface a mild-mannered, English-speaking former ophthalmologist, has viciously clung to power in a civil war that has killed nearly 500,000 of his own people. It has also led to the biggest refugee crisis since World War II, with hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees streaming into Europe. In his short time in office, President Trump has made headlines with his controversial executive orders banning refugees, including those from Syria. The grinding war in Syria has drawn in many world powers, including Iran and Russia, whose troops are on the ground propping up the Syrian regime. Last year, I was on the ground with the Russian forces in Syria. We went to sea on board a Russian destroyer, sailed out into the Mediterranean, and saw just how much firepower Moscow is committed to this effort.
The Russian missile cruiser Varyag, it's got cruise missiles on board, and it not only is supporting the Russian campaign in Syria, it's sending a signal to the rest of the world about the Russian Navy's modern capabilities.
And at the main Russian airbase in western Syria, the jets are roaring day and night, the perimeter bristling with helicopter gunships.
This is the tip of the spear of Russian air power in Syria.
The Russian commitment here makes U.S. military involvement tonight in Syria all the more complicated.
And Terry Moran is with us from London now. Terry, what was the impact, would you say, of the Russian intervention on the course of the Syrian war?
You know, Dan, they changed the war. They won the war, essentially, for the regime of President Bashar Al Assad when they came in.
Given how powerfully the Russians have invested in the regime of Bashar Al Assad, how do you reckon they're reacting behind the scenes at the Kremlin tonight?
Well, one very good thing is that apparently the U.S. military gave a heads up to the Russian military, who helped rebuild the air base that was destroyed tonight, that there was going to be an attack to deconflict, essentially, to protect them. And so that was essentially good news. But what Russia will react against is the very notion of unilateral action that threatens one of their allies. They are not tremendously committed to Bashar al-Assad's regime. One of the Russian officers we embedded with said that when they arrived, they were shocked at how corrupt and degraded the regime was. But they do not want to see the United States picking and choosing regime change around the world, and they want to be at the table in any kind of determination of Syria's future.
Terry Moran reporting from London tonight. Terry, thank you. And for more on this breaking story, we have ABC News correspondents Martha Raddatz and Brian Ross here with me in New York and in Washington. Colonel Steve Ganyard, our military analyst, and at the White House, ABC News reporter Cecilia Vega. Let me start with you, Brian. You've been reporting on the sensitivities around intervening in Russia's zone of influence. What did the U.S. military have to take into account as they carried out these attacks?
Well, one of the most sensitive parts of the attack was to make sure no Russians were targeted or hit. And they also had to make sure that the Russian anti-aircraft missile systems didn't launch and go after the cruise missiles that were coming off the U.S. ships. So that was very sensitive. They were looking really for a one-night war without escalating this, without bringing Russia into it in some way, forcing the Russians to defend or to retaliate. And it was also important in terms of the relationship and the dynamics of ISIS and al-Qaeda, which remain active in Syria. Whenever the Assad regime is weakened, it's a victory, in a sense, for ISIS and al-Qaeda. So the point was to make this just a message, not a real weakening of the Assad regime.
Well, you use this term one-night war. What can you really achieve with a one-night war? Does this change the facts on the ground at all, Martha?
I don't think it really does. I mean, this wasn't a strategic strike and hurting Assad going forward. It's this one airfield. It is a punishing airstrike. They took out aircraft. They took out fuel supplies. They took out some of the surrounding infrastructure. But he has many other airfields. I mean, obviously, it was meant to control the air attacks with chemical weapons, and it may do that to a small degree, but we don't really know where any other chemical weapons are. They removed massive amounts of chemical weapons in 2013 after Assad agreed to that, but they clearly hid some of them, don't know where the others are. But the Americans were very sure this was the airfield. They knew those two aircraft, where those two aircraft took off from. Obviously, they didn't know at the time they were armed with chemical weapons, but they were absolutely certain that's where they took off from.
And Colonel Ganyard in Washington, D.C., where do we go next with this? Are we now embroiled fully in Syria's civil war?
Hopefully not, Dan. Hopefully this is it. And I think, as Martha and Brian were talking about, the attack was so prescribed. It was so in such a small area that the intent here was to send a message and not to get into a wider war. If you look back at some of the targets that the Pentagon had offered up to President Obama, there was a wide variety. It was going to be not only a punishing strike, but it was going to degrade the Syrian military. In this case, this is just one small airfield. It's an auxiliary airfield. It really isn't going to change the facts on the ground. So it's a statement. It's really not a degradation of Syrian military capability.
Do you think this has any ties at all to the decision this week to take his chief strategist, Steve Bannon, off the National Security Council and perhaps empower the military minds around him?
I don't. This was more of an emotional decision by the president. But one of the things we need to realize, Dan, is this was one airfield. It's where the chemical attack was launched from. But Assad has been killing babies by the thousands over the years, and this one strike tonight is not going to stop the Assad regime from dropping barrel bombs and conventional weapons on civilians. So we may see a decrement in people being gassed to death, but he's still going to continue to kill innocents throughout Syria.
Well, now, let me just pick up on what you said, Colonel Ganyard, with Cecilia, because you said hopefully not, we're not pulled into a wider war here. But Cecilia, we heard the president say tonight that he's calling on all civilized nations to end the slaughter on the ground in Syria. What's your sense of where the White House wants to go now? Because that certainly sounded like a pretty big goal.
Well, Dan, one of the things that President Trump has stuck to since the campaign through his very short presidency is this promise to not tell us exactly where he's going to go and foreshadow what his decisions will be militarily. What we are seeing in this White House right now is a president making these decisions and evolving about his positions on Syria in real time. If you just go back not that long ago to last year, he had said, essentially, this is not our problem. The fight in Syria has nothing to do with us. And just yesterday, right here in the White House, his position, he said, had changed after seeing those images of those children in Syria after that chemical attack. President Trump had said that he was moved, and you're seeing decisions being made from a very different person, right, than someone who was campaigning. A big shift happening here tonight from President Trump.
Indeed, and we're going to be talking about President Trump's evolution as this show continues tonight. But let's stick to the situation on the ground in Syria. What's next here in terms of retaliation? Does the Syrian government have to respond? Is there any other potential blowback that we as Americans should be worried about?
Well, I suspect there won't be much of a response because it wouldn't do much good to respond that way, and President Trump might decide to hit them again. I want to pick up a little bit on what Cecilia said, too. I mean, he may not like to tell us when a tactical military strike is coming, but what is the strategy going forward? What are they going to do if the rest of the world doesn't rally around him? Because they certainly didn't rally around Barack Obama to take action against Bashar Al Assad. Then what's next? Does President Trump decide for another airstrike, then another airstrike? You have to talk about what your strategy is, what your goal is in Syria, and how you accomplish that. Do you accomplish that? It's kind of clear Rex Tillerson wants to put pressure on Russia. He wants to have some diplomatic pressure to bring the world together. But that's a very, very big if.
So many variables at play tonight. We want to point out, I mentioned before, the rather stunning evolution we've seen on the part of President Trump. And when we come back here on Nightline, we're going to take a look at what he said as a candidate, what he's saying now, and what might explain it.